Good afternoon, everyone. This is Reyes Amides with Fresh Arts. I am the Programs Outreach Coordinator. And if this is the first time you're tuning in, welcome. Fresh Arts is an arts nonprofit organization based out of Houston, Texas. But through our digital programming, such as this one, we have hopefully a much further reach. If you've been here before, thank you for tuning in again. Today is a discussion, a really important one. We feel at Fresh Arts to have. And this is part of a series of cultivating equity in the arts. And so last time we had arts writers of color and their experiences and how we can include more arts writing on artists of color by writers of color. But equity looks and is applied in many different ways. And so today we're going to be focusing on language justice. This is only just kind of like a sample of what is happening in regards to how we create more equitable arts access. And so this is kind of the beginning of our conversation, but again, this is a conversation that needs to happen. And again, in addressing the many different ways that equity can happen. And so language is one aspect, an important one. But next week, we'll be discussing more of physical access to the arts. Today will be language access and what that looks like exactly. And so this is something that, including Fresh Arts, arts organizations need to learn from and learn about. And so hopefully this will give a good introduction or at least a good addition to any conversations that are happening regarding language arts, language access in the arts. And so today we'll have two really great guests. One will be Jose Eduardo Sanchez with Antena. They are primarily known for doing Spanish interpreting, but they do so many great things, including training, publications, all that amazing stuff. And we'll get more information from Jose when we get to that part of the discussion. And then we'll have Ricky Harris, who will be speaking about ASL access and why that's important in the arts. And obviously let Ricky speak to that experience. And with that, we'll have ASL interpreters here on the stream in order to facilitate that conversation. So I'm excited for it. Certainly one that Fresh Arts is still learning about. So this is part of that process, but we're happy to have it. And so just one other thing that I want to clarify, we're saying interpreting because interpreting is the live interpreting of one language to another, as opposed to translation, which is more document writing based. So just keep that in mind, and oral or signed. So again, we'll let the pros speak about that aspect about it, but I just want to introduce that into the conversation. All right, so yeah, please, let's welcome our guests.
Hello.
Awesome. Welcome. So I'm going to pose the first question, and this is to Jose. Can you give an overview of your work and what services programs you typically provide as part of Antena? You're on mute, sorry.
There we go. Thank you, Reyes. Yeah, so Antenna Houston is a local collective of interpreters and translators, artists, organizers, folks who are committed to using language as a tool to create more inclusive and equitable multilingual spaces and to build the capacity of social movements to change and create the world that we want to live. And so, as you mentioned, we do a lot of interpretation work, which is, as you said, right, it's oral or signed, which is what we're probably most known for because it's the most visible part of our work. But we also do translation work. We do a lot of community workshops and trainings to support community interpreters. We work with different nonprofit organizations, grassroots social groups here in Houston to support them in making sure that they're creating spaces in their organizing work and their movement work where folks can bring the entirety of themselves into the work. And we think that language, the language you speak in, the language you dream in, the language you scheme in, that is a huge part of who we are. and that is something that's necessary to include as we are trying to create a better world, as we are trying to transform systems and institutions.
Awesome, thank you. And I know you're a talented poet in your own right, so
Yeah, thank you.
just want to mention that.
Thank you. Likewise.
And now, Ricky, same question. Can you provide an overview of your work and what services and programs you've typically done or provided?
Yes, hello. My name is Ricky Harris. I am deaf myself. I do use American Sign Language. I am actually a deafness and hard of hearing communication resource specialist here in the local area, as well Houston area, as well as the 13 surrounding counties of Houston. So we are under a state contract actually with the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services under Health and Human Health Services Commission. So we focus mostly on advocacy as well as in empowering the deaf community and the hard of hearing community to be able to connect to language and language throughout the community as well. But communication access really is our number one goal when working with the community. So I am a community liaison, meaning that I work facilitating work with deaf and hard of hearing services and other resources throughout the community, or organizations or agencies that may provide services. Sometimes these agencies and organizations don't even know that they have, these deaf constituents. And so I let them know how to connect to that community. And they realize, oh, it is a really simple, easy process. And we're able to facilitate that. Also being able to get people more involved in, the mainstream America. So with Disabilities Act through the American ADA or the federal laws that are provided, it allows deaf people to really come into the American community with communication access. So that's one of my main jobs, is to be able to teach and train related to those laws and empower the community at the same time. Also teaching them how to request services, whether it be accommodations, and get those resources. So I have a lot of different hats on a day-to-day basis. I'm being perfectly honest. I can keep going on and on about all the things that I do, but basically, yes, it's to make sure that any events or anything does have that communication access provided.
Thank you, Ricky. Could you also just state what the organization and what you mean by we?
Yes, there's 6 total, but we focus primarily from the Office and Deaf of Hard of Hearing Services. It's a state-run organization, and it's under Health and Human Services Service, that's the one we. I also work under a interpreting agency called Sworenson Interpreting. They are a communication focused agency, and that their number one goal is to provide interpreting services. But really, who provides this is the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing. We work, let me think, we work under the mayor's office for people with disabilities, also the Houston Commission on Disabilities. There's several other specific resource and recovery, career resource and recovery services. So we provide a lot of different services for communication access within the Houston area and the other 13 counties. And we also provide training. So I want to say that's who we are, is kind of a plethora of we. So again, it's which hat I'm donning for that day. But really, yes, the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services are where we're provided from.
Amazing. No, thank you for that word. That's incredible. So my next question, and this will go for Jose first. What does a typical day or event look like for an interpreter? What often helps simplify an interpreter's work that an organization can have ready?
Yeah, that's a great question, and part of it was what we were doing right before this this meeting started, right? Checking in with the interpreters, making sure that we're on the same page about what the program's going to be. But really, the funny thing about interpreting is that a lot of the times folks go to a meeting and they either are wearing the headset or are watching the ASL interpreters live, and they see that as sort of like they see the end product, but they don't see all of the work that has to go in behind the scenes, and making sure that we have all of the logistics of the event, making sure that we have enough equipment for our case where we often use simultaneous interpretation equipment, making sure that also the program is actually going to be inclusive to folks who don't speak the language, right? Because we don't want to. It's great to have all sorts of interpretation, but if we're not reaching out as arts organizations or institutions to communities who don't speak English or who are hard of hearing, then it's going to be hard for them to show up, even if you do have all of the interpretation and translation materials there, right? So a lot of it is working with organizations beforehand to talk about who is your community, how are you connecting with them, how are you bringing them in, and also creating spaces for them, right? There's a difference between saying like, hey, you don't speak English, I'm going to create this little space for you to come in as part of my larger organization, versus saying like, no, we're going to put you at the center of this work. We're going to create programming that actually responds to your needs, to what you want to see, and create those kinds of spaces. So yeah, it's a lot of planning, a lot of conversations, and I appreciate what we called it at the beginning, right? It's a process. It's a process, and different groups, different organizations are going to be at different points in that process. But we definitely think of it as something that's always ongoing and always evolving in our work.
Thank you. Yeah, I will say that one quick, quote unquote, quick fix that people or organizations tend to think is like, oh, we'll hire the one person who now speaks Spanish. So that is going to be the way that we address this issue, or we think that by hiring this one person to do all that work, it's now going to open these floodgates. But right, as you said, I mean, it's a process. It's one of how do you center the accessibility and equity. So Ricky, same question. What does kind of like that typical work look like for you? And how can organizations simplify this work for interpreters to come and do their work?
Well, honestly, for me, every day is different. It's never going to be the same. Every single day is going to present its own complex issue and situation that comes up. The most important thing for us is to remain flexible. So I always try to interpreter their everyday life. I try to imagine what that would look like, but for a deaf or hard of hearing community, and for the deaf or hard of hearing individuals, especially here in America, we have actually 7 different kinds of sign language just in the US alone. So in Texas, we have 5. So we have American Sign Language, which is what I'm using right now, and I have the interpreter that I'm currently working with using American Sign Language. There's also Signed Exact English, which is typically used in K through 12 settings, typically. And then there's also LSM, which is Latina Mexican Sign Language. When people coming here from Mexico to either visit or live or whatever situation they're using, they may not have the language to be able to use that here. And so a lot of times we don't have interpreters to be able to use that LSM with them. So for those situations, we actually have to pull in a certified deaf interpreter to work at an international level with them, or a universal sign language. Now, there's also a Northern Sign Language that is used, which is hard to kind of figure out, what sign is used. It's not often used, and once we find that is the specific language being used, to be able to find a person that is certified or specialized in MSS, it's called. Now, whether that be somebody that has ASL background or as a CDI, it's hard to be able to satisfy that whole need. So that's really an everyday situation on what is needed, how do we find it, how do we provide that accommodation, and if it's not available, can we find a backup? Is that possible? So, not just bringing in a run-of-the-mill person, but but really being able to take this information that we're getting and be able to satisfy that person's needs for communication access. So that's, and when we do that, that's when we win. As well as we provide advocacy services. Oftentimes, doctors' offices refuse to provide communication. And we say, hey, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act, it really is something that you have to follow. It's a federal law. You have to be compliant with that and be able to provide an interpreter. And it is a back and forth conversation at that point. So the Health and Human Services Commissioner, HHS, uses what's called ACA, and it's the Affordable Care Act. So by using that Affordable Care Act, there's a specific tenet that says they have to use interpreters when providing these services. So, and when they say interpreter, they say what means effective, what is effective communication. So it doesn't necessarily just mean a certified interpreter. It means somebody that is able to provide effective communication. So again, they'll say, oh, we'll just bring in a sign language interpreter. Any sign language interpreter will do. Well, what may work for me may not work for another patient. So even if Tara works wonderful for me, this interpreter right now, she may not work with another patient. So, you know, unfortunately, I've had to let interpreters go before, and it's all about that advocacy, being able to communicate and tell people what is effective communication for me and for each community member. So I would say really 75% of the time, ASL would work, but that other 25%, we really have to help that process go through and make sure that equal access is happening and that we're able to get those language barriers and those cultural barriers removed. And that's our everyday struggle, really. Whether I give presentations or you know, just doing that everyday work. I give presentations to hospitals, to police officers on how to be able to provide communication access, the community of Houston, and just provide training on accommodations and how to interact with the deaf and hard of hearing. So there's a variety of ways, but I can't say any day is necessarily the same.
Yeah. And
thank you. That's amazing.
Regis, if I might, I just wanted to respond really quickly. I just echo everything that Ricky was saying, right? Like, I think he was spot on and all of that. And just two key takeaways from that for me is that interpreting is high skilled, really hard work, right? And I think in a city like Houston, where there's a lot of bilingual folks, we have a really large Latinx population, it's really easy to just pull someone who is in your office who happens to speak Spanish. You walk into the doctor's office, a mom has her kids, and they get pulled in to interpret when they don't have the support, they don't have the training, they don't have the background to be able to, as Ricky was saying, right, actually foster effective communication, right? And that has a lot to do with valuing interpretation as really important, necessary labor. And also that if we are going to put in someone, you know, we do have to be flexible, but if we are going to pull in the bilingual staff member or the bilingual volunteer last minute to interpret, then we should be supporting them and making sure that they have the tools to do a really good job. And the second thing too, that again, like, I just want to uplift what Ricky was saying. These are, like, you're not doing anyone a favor when you have an interpreter, right? It's not, you're not doing me a favor, you're not doing my community a favor. It's something that I deserve. Like, as a human being, I should be able to participate in the language in which I feel most comfortable. I should be able to have access to, especially civic life, a lot of these public institutions. Like, we're not doing people favors. We're actually, like, that's what we deserve. That's a very minimum that we deserve to be doing for folks.
Absolutely, Jose. If I can respond, that is just like you just said. You hit the nail on the head. I mean, oftentimes people are saying, "Oh, come on, you could just come and interpret for them, right? Or you can fingerspell and look and just." But are they able to do that vernacular, that specific register of language that's needed for effective communication, or the accurate terminology that's needs? that it needs? Are they able to remain impartial? Are they able to fluently express in both expressive and receptive? So that's what it means for a qualified interpreter. If they can't do that, they'll bring in mom or bring in, brother or and brother and mom maybe just can say H I hi, HOW how. That's not effective. Period. It's not effective. And that gets my blood boiling sometimes because sometimes I'll just start flying with my finger spelling. They're like, oh, please slow down. Please slow down. Can you do that again for me? And I have no patience for it, if I'm being perfectly honest, because I have a natural flow. I want to be able to go back and forth and have that effective communication like every other person in this world. And people think, oh, well, it's good enough. We're providing something, so that's good enough. That needs to stop. That kind of practice needs to stop by bringing in professional pro interpreters that have this experience. And you also mentioned about interpreters being be able to prepare when they're being brought into platforms and jobs. There have been several times, it's not the first time, and it won't be the last time, if I'm being honest, that there's an emergency situation that and we have to call in an interpreter last minute to work in a platform type situation. And sometimes people just forget or they just don't call the interpreter at all. And I have to find navigate through this array of people to try to find a resource that other individual is responsible for. And then I have to find this other individual and remind them and say, hey, you're responsible to provide an interpreter, right? Oh yeah, sure. We're providing, just bare minimum. No, I have to almost, assault these people to be able to make sure that my rights are being met through federal disability law, through FEMA, regulations, through the FCC regulations and their guidelines, to be able to have an interpreter for these platforms. And people are just willingly forget about it, which that again is one of my jobs, is to find those people that are responsible for those things to make sure that I'm reminding them. But it can be irritating and infuriating.
Beautifully stated, both of you. Thank you so much. And kind of, we've mentioned health and human services. We've mentioned social services, but in the context of arts programming, like my next question, and Jose, you can start off answering, why is it important to include these services in arts programming? Things that, may not be seen as necessary.
Yeah, I think that's something that I also have to grapple with in my own artistic practice. But I think, two main things come to mind for me and my experience with my community. One is that, again, language is not just, for me, it's not just about how I communicate. Language is also how I see the world, right? Language is how I interpret the world around me. Language is embedded with my culture, with the memories and of my ancestors, with trauma, with joy, with celebration, with all these histories. And so when I'm in a space where I don't see that reflected in the work that's being done, but in where I can't bring that part of myself in, right? That's telling me something. Whether it's explicit or implicit, that's telling me something about my how I can be in that space, right? And I think institutions should really be asking, like, what are these messages that we're sending to the community? Because it's if you're not saying anything, that's actually saying something, right? If you're like not addressing language in your work, that's telling people something about what it means, what you really think about those communities. So I think it's important to as much as art is part of language, language is part of art, right? And so if we're talking about how we interpret the world, how we're reflecting the world around us, how we're responding to what's going on, I think that to me is a really important intersection. But the other piece too, and I just want to uplift the work of Alice Wong, who is an amazing disability rights and disability justice activist, and she talks about access is love, and I can't tell you how many times like organizations will put on a flyer that there will be interpretation, or that there will be parking, or that there will be, that there will be food at the event. But even if it's something as simple as like, what, for this particular event, this is going to be all in English. I, as a non-English speaking person, can then make the decision on my own, right? To be like, oh, maybe I do want to experience this because there's something else that I'm going to get out of it. Or actually, no, this might not be the right event for me. But if you just create these spaces where the neutral or the default is always spoken English, right? Then it's hard to adjust to that too, right? It's not even about like, yeah, sometimes we're not going to be able to have interpreters. Sometimes we're not going to be able to address that. But at least acknowledging that, right? Acknowledging that as part of your program flyer, acknowledging that on your website. This is an English. This can be a program in English. We will not be able to have interpretation. That just lets me know, like, wow, they at least thought of it. They at least thought that language could play a role in me being able to participate in this, and then I can make my own decision as like based on my self agency and my needs. But yeah, I think those two things are important. Like one, right, like language and how it's tied to culture, to history, to memory, but then also language as part of just like, why should I be going to your art spaces, as beautiful and amazing as they might be, if you're not thinking about me and my language needs and how I might experience that, right?
Thank you. Thank you. Let's pause for a second to allow a shift in interpreters. Thank you. So, same question, Ricky. Again, we've talked about health and human services. We've talked about these different programs that are federally protected, we may see as necessary, and they are. But why is it important to include these accessibility services in arts that are often maybe not seen as necessary?
Yeah, so there's just a lot of things happening, and I'm trying to narrow it down. But this happened recently, maybe my third time with an organization by the name of Real Abilities, and I went and I helped those folks out as their guest speaker, and so I provided what language, what silence looks like, and everything that's involved in filming and their art, and I just shared with them and how they can connect with their their experiences to the world through language art, and that was very helpful. I was able to connect that, and then also, I was just curious on what the heart is. That's art. Poetry. And just sharing your heart, and that becomes involved in art, and just seeing how frustrating and how discriminatory and how angry and and the silences and how that come and manifest in art, and making it visual. Of course, art is visual. And sometimes, I go to a museum and I can, I don't need an interpreter, and I just wander and I look around and I see the pictures and I see the descriptions below. And, most videos have captioning. And I'm just amazed, it's really in touch with the world and just connecting with today. And it's just, it's fantastic. And it depends on if somebody wants to, discuss art history about Monet, or about, Van Gogh, or, about a different famous artist, and explain history. Of course, we need ASL interpretation or some kind of captioning, something that I can watch. And I want an interpreter there sometimes, so that I can ask a question, so I can say, hey, something related to this history. How can, art, why did they pick that color or that style or that method, or, and how they put it to the portrait. And so, how, what notes uh, did they make through all that? And so it just depends on what the art is offering us. And so, the captioning that's there, watching a presentation about art, the interpreter, interpreting services, and then whatever is in, this real abilities, and seeing all the filming and the captioning that goes with that. It's just, deaf people have amazing ways of showing their, and it's really accommodating to the deaf discussion. And so, in this accessibility to art is very important to get that communication so that we understand art and how and its work. So yeah.
Thank you. So this next question goes into the idea of budgets, right, and paying for these services. And y'all are saying that yes, this is skilled labor. This is important to be paid for, that to pay the labor of interpreters. And the best way I heard it said was that budgets are inherently political documents. They prioritize who they want to be there, right? And so kind of like one thing that I often hear from organizations is that there's no room in the budget for interpreters or for language accessibility. Jose, can you speak to that concern, or what have you?
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. Budgets are political. Budgets are values documents, and we are writing down and putting a money sign next to the things that are important to us. And so, I'm not gonna. I want to acknowledge that there's definitely a huge diversity of arts institutions in Houston. There's some institutions that are, ridiculously well funded, that have access to a lot of money, that have endowments. There's some other grassroots arts organizations that are all volunteer run, that basically, are barely able to pay the rent on their space, who are having to develop other ways to bring art to the community. But I think, again, going back to what I was saying before, right? Like the idea that yes, budgets are political, budgets are values documents, but also oftentimes budgets are used as a stopgap to the conversation, right? I'll call an organization, they want interpretation, we share our rates, and they say like, oh, we don't have that in the budget, right? So we can't do this because we don't have enough budget, as opposed to saying like, oh, you know what, that, how can we find the funds? How can we maybe collaborate with a larger institution? How can we do a small fundraising campaign online? How can we allocate maybe this little chunk of this budget? Or how can we think about that for the next grant that we write, or for the next petition that we do? That it's very rare that I get to have those conversations, because it's almost like, oh, there's so many in the budget. Okay, that's the end of that conversation. Next, let's move on to something, as opposed to like, oh, there's so money in the budget. But we actually think this is really important. So how can we go about maybe being able to find funds somewhere, or to work with community interpreters, right? We do have a solidarity network that we organize here in Houston, and it's a group of folks who have been trained, who are skilled, who are supported, and we respond to organizations that have very small budgets, that are volunteer run, or that have very few funds, but who are committed to language justice, right? Who are committed to bringing in folks who speak different languages into their spaces, and we'll be able to send out interpreters to interpret their event pro bono, or we'll be able to take their program and do the translation for free, right? Obviously, if the MFAH calls us to do a volunteer interpreter an event as volunteers, like, we're probably going to say no, because they probably have access to money somewhere. But if it's a smaller organization that, again, that we know is committed to the values of language justice, that is willing to continue to create these spaces that are accessible, that are participatory, then we're more than happy to work with them as well, right? So I guess the question is like, don't let the budget be the reason why you don't have interpretation, why you don't have materials translated, etc., right? If you really care about the role that language can play in your work.
Thank you. Ricky, same question, the same context of being, I often hear organizations say that there's simply no room in the budget for language accessibility. Can you speak to this concern or respond to that?
Yes, I'm still thinking on what, Jose had just mentioned, and I was going through all of those, and and trying to answer something a little bit differently. So if there's an art center or a location, and they do have money, it's through a national fund for art or whatever, and they have their national foundation and for art, and they get that money federally. Some of those funds are taken from state entities, and so why there is that barrier for accommodation? It seems like they have those laws, or they say under the ADA you have to provide accommodation, and then that's it. They can't say no, and so you need to have something behind, ready in advance, and so you need to have that budget, for overhead, like an overhead budget, and that should be how all businesses are run. And so I still don't understand why people are saying no. We don't have it in the budget, but that money is coming from the state, and it's coming coming through federal venues, and that's what it's there for making it accessible for people with disabilities, with hearing loss, and so that they can enjoy these things. So just like everybody else. And often people just don't know. And they don't know about what, the tax incentives that are there. They forget about that. If we remind them, hey, there is a tax incentive, and when they do hear of that, or when they do see that, they provide, I can provide that that information or those resources. Sometimes I have gone and argued back and forth with them, and some of them just had a hard no. And just like you already said, there is politics involved, and it's like, too bad. This is what the law says, and you can't argue with it. You can't say no to the law. It's right there. And so if they're still stubborn, and that's fine, then that will lead to some to court, and they could lose funding through that. And so until it's fixed, and I hate to say that, but it's true. It is necessary, and which is cheaper, getting an interpreter or the court cost? They have to weigh that, and it's your budget. So
Thank you so much for that. So I think y'all have already kind of spoken to what are some basic steps organizations can take to make accessibility possible for their constituents. So I'm going to kind of go a little bit further into what are some organizations or programs or efforts that you appreciate or making great strides in language justice efforts. So I'll ask that Jose first.
Yeah, great. Yeah, here locally, we work with a lot of really amazing organizations that ironically are some of the, have some of the smaller access to funds, have like tiny budgets. Some of them are volunteer run, but they are often the ones that are very much committed to creating multilingual spaces and committed to creating inclusive spaces for everyone. We've had the pleasure of working with OLTT, which is Organización Latina Trans de Texas, or Latina Trans Organization of Texas, for our ASL interpreter. and they do amazing work, both as Ricky was saying, right? Not only in the spaces that they create, but also in being really passionate advocates for language justice in any of the other spaces that they're being invited to. We also work with West Street Recovery, with a lot of their different neighborhood organizing committees and groups. And again, these are mostly volunteer-run grassroots groups that really are committed to making sure that folks are connecting, are building relationships, are building trust, and are building the connections needed, right, to take collective action, to move forward, to get more funding for improved drainage in their neighborhood, or to have better access to funds as like trans immigrant communities here in Houston. And so I think there's definitely folks in the city, and I also just want to uplift the work of CPC, which is the Center for Participatory Change, and they're based out of Asheville, North Carolina. But they have a lot of amazing resources and tools that can be that organizations can access, and they have really good models also, right, of how to again not just think of language as a checkbox that you have to click, like, oh yeah, we interpreted this, we translated this, but again, how are we making sure that we are centering those communities that are often excluded because of language, especially when in a city like Houston, where there are over 100 languages that are spoken, where there's a really vibrant immigrant and refugee community, right? So I think we're in a city where this is not only like something that could happen. It just, I'm really surprised why we don't see more of it, right? And so I think thinking of that thinking of it in that perspective, right? It's not just a checklist that you tick off, you pat yourself in the back and say, "Oh yeah, I had an interpreter." Again, going back to what you were saying, you and Ricky were saying at the beginning, it's a process. It's a process about evaluating your work. It's a process about evaluating how you are organizing your programming. Which artists are you inviting to show? Which talks, which plays, which readings are you uplifting, and then going from there. So yeah.
Thank you. Ricky, same question. What are some other organizations or programs you appreciate who are making great strides in language justice efforts?
To be honest, Houston faces a lot of challenges, and it's not recognized in the deaf and hard of hearing community. It's a struggle. The only one, the organization that's really caught my eye, that's really, that I'm starstruck over, it's the apple of my eye, it's is Real Abilities, REEL Abilities. Yeah, they provide support, and they still do. And for example, a few months ago, they had invited a guest by the name of Marley Matlin, and she was a speaker, and she shared that was just one example, and I was just like, wow. And they actually brought an impact on everybody, and it was impactful on the community and all of us, and that language justice. And so so far, that's the one that I see here in Houston, and I'm starting to see others pop up. There's one in Austin. There's one in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. These organizations are showing their artwork, and and every constituent in that organization, and they're not being as recognized, and that's the struggle. And in Washington, D.C., they have Gallaudet University, and that's the only liberal arts college in the world for deaf individuals. And so they have artwork, they have film making, and that's, you see all those things popping up and is starting to disseminate all over the country. And so those are the things, and it's hard to get recognized. And so I'm encouraging organizations to take, people under their wings and to show the support, to show their support of their work. And the NTID, the National Technology Institute for the Deaf in Rochester, New York, that was in RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology. There are programs there, especially their photography. It's going crazy, and there are art galleries that they've started disseminating. So that's another one that I recognize. Another one in California, CSUN, California State University at Northridge, I believe. There's sculptures, part of the poetry that they share, and that's another organization. Organizations take time to come up, and there's not one that has a really big name. The one that really stands out is Real Abilities here in Houston, and that's the one that I have high regard for.
Thank you. So there's so many offshoots and discussions we can have of this amazing discussion. I'm gonna ask one more question just out of respect for everyone's time. I'll start with Ricky. Do you have any shout outs, anything you want to mention, any last words you want to provide to our audience?
Wow. I would ask everyone to be flexible. To make everything accessible as possible. We have amazing technology. We have amazing communication access. It doesn't have to be an interpreter. Just be flexible, and being exposed and introducing people to art. Art doesn't have to be just a painting. It could be video. It could be photography. But introduce them to that, to those different things, and also to be open-minded. An open mind it can meet your goal of providing communication access, and we can use everybody to be our advocates. And so if there is no advocates, if there is no communication access, then we are depriving their ability of understanding art, understanding them and their future. It's going to not be there. How are they going to dream? How are they going to have a vision for their future? We are depriving them because of we're depriving the language. And so language justice, I'm just encouraging access. That's my comment to the audience.
Thank you. Jose, same question. Any last words, any parting words that you want to give to our audience, any shout outs, anything you want?
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna steal part of Ricky's response, because I'm also a big fan of Real Abilities here in Houston, and I've gotten to check out their film festival for several years, which is one of my favorites here in Houston. And what I love about that in particular is not just that the film festival itself is accessible, but that the films that they are showcasing are about folks who are living with disabilities. And they're not just people with disabilities. They're people with disabilities who are gay, people with disabilities who are Black, people with disabilities who are immigrants, right? And I've learned so much, and also not just about myself, but about just the broader community, because it's not like disability is not an issue, right? Like language, just like language access is not an issue. It's so intricately connected with other parts of who we are, right? Our gender, our race, our immigration status, our ability, disability, all those things are very connected. So I would just really encourage folks, especially organizations who are looking at how to make their programming more accessible, how to use language as a tool to democratize their spaces, to not see it as a separate topic, but see how does language connect to the work you're already doing? How does language connect to other communities that you also want to reach and that you also want to center, right? Because most of the time what you're going to find is that they are very much connected, right? And that it's not just like, just because I speak Spanish, I doesn't mean that I don't, you know, have an experience being poor or being working class, or just because I speak ASL doesn't mean that I can't be gay or lesbian or transgender. And so, yeah, really looking at it as who are the communities, who are the human beings in communities that you want in your work, right? And go from there, because again, if we are just looking at these issues, it's hard then to just check a box and move on. But if we really want to transform the way that we do the work, right? And the topic of this whole series is cultivating equity in the arts. If we really want to transform the arts where there are spaces that are actually inclusive and equitable, you have to see the whole picture, not just tiny slices of the issue that we're trying to change.
Thank you two so much.
Beautiful.
Thank you two so much for the work you're doing. Happy to have this amazing discussion. Everyone, please check their work out. Thank you so much. Till next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, there you have it. I mean, that was, oh man, that was a gift to learn so much in the span of like 50 something minutes. I wish there could be just so much more conversation and discussion, but time's a jerk like that sometimes. But again, thank you, just an immense thank you again to those guests. It was beautiful. It was a really beautiful discussion, and I hope everyone here that is listening appreciates kind of that conversation that just happened. So please check out Antenna Houston on Instagram and Facebook. Just go at Antenna Houston, spelled ANTENA Houston on Instagram and Facebook. Also want to thank Sorensen that provided the interpreters. Amazing, I'm sure challenging work, but again, it just goes to show what's available and who's capable of doing what. And I think that, again, that's a gift into itself. So there you have it. That's, again, just one slice, as the guests are saying. This is just one slice of equity in the arts, and it's a concerted effort. It's a form of progress and a process that we have to discuss and move forward with. Really, a lot of excuses that we may have as organizations or as individuals in creating equitable spaces, the resources are there. We just have to do the work of cultivating that equity. So again, I'm still in awe of the conversation we just had. So that was beautiful. So kind of moving forward, again, next week, we're going to have another great discussion in regards to cultivating equity in the arts. And that is speaking with organizations or individuals that provide or manage programs that are aimed at different marginalized groups. And again, this is to kind of foster that conversation of how are we seeing human beings and how are we bringing them into the fold, and whether or not we're doing what we need to do to include them. And so next week is going to be another great, amazing discussion. So again, next Thursday's conversation right there, Cultivating Equity in the Arts, Programming for Marginalized Artists. Some other ending notes. The summit. Have you heard about it? Should. It's the Fresh Arts Summit. It's going virtual. And so you're going to join us. You can join us on August 7th and 8th. Save the date. It's going to be a really, really great 2 days of sessions and programming for artists that is geared towards professional development and adjusting one's practice to this landscape. And so we're curating a selection of sessions and professionals and experts that can speak to this transition perhaps a lot of us are taking in regards to putting our creative practice online. And how do we make money from that? How do we bring in audiences? How do we share our work in what may be a new landscape for a lot of people, or more of an investment than ever before? So please. And then kind of to move forward again, tune in next week. There is no resource roundup with Reyes. That is first and third Tuesday of the months. So that won't be for another not next week, but the week after that. Another thing to keep in mind is to, again, consider joining our squad. Continuing to offer these unique, free, and vitally important resources requires a network of support. So we kindly ask that you consider supporting our organization by becoming a friend of Fresh Arts. If you have the means, your support allows us to develop resources that respond to the unique needs of artists and artist-led organizations in our region and help strengthen the arts sector by supporting the people who make it all possible, the artists. And so, again, to continue on that note, in the last couple of months, Fred, these series of discussions, webinars, workshops, virtual conversations have reached over 30,000 views. To better inform us of the impact of this initiative, we humbly invite viewers, to complete our brief impact survey. Your response will allow us to continue these efforts and inform the future of our programming. So please fill out that survey. It's really, really, really going to help us out. So I implore you, because again, how we move forward, what things to consider, where to reach out to, that's incredibly informed by you, the viewer, who are watching this. So if you haven't filled out a survey, please do so. It helps us out immensely. So next week, we continue the series, as I stated before. Next Thursday, 4 p.m., tune in. Subscribe to our newsletters if you haven't already. Subscribe to all of our social media where we're having all these incredible, fruitful discussions. I'm still like processing that conversation. That was great. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to you, the viewer. Thank you to Angela on the back end, who is producing this and is doing an amazing job. Thank you, the viewer. So yeah, oh, there you go. Yeah, Tara, Nemo, you did amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sorensen, for that. Yeah, I'll see you next time, and stay safe, stay well. Later.